welcome. I see people still coming in. Thank you, everyone, for being here. We'll take just another minute for everyone to get logged in. All right. Okay, welcome everyone to the Foundation for Teaching Economics webinar on U.S. income equality. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Professor Scott Baier. He's currently the chair of the economics department at Clemson University. In addition, he served as a visiting scholar with the Federal Reserve Bank in Atlanta. Professor Scott Baier was also a senior economist on President George Bush's Council for Economic Advisors. Professor Baier's research interests focus on understanding the causes and consequences of globalization and the economic impact of free trade agreements and economic growth. His knowledge of economic data and where to find it makes him an astute observer of the American economy. Professor Baier's also been a longtime instructor in our Economics for Leaders program, and we're very grateful for him being here today to give us this webinar. We'll have a recording of this webinar as well as Professor Baier's slide deck available a couple of days following this. And after the presentation, we'll have about 10 to 15 minutes for questions. Please use the Q&A feature you'll find at the bottom of your screen. Use that to submit questions, and then go ahead and upvote other attendees' questions so we can find which ones are gauging the most interest, and we'll answer them in that order. And following the webinar, we'll ask you to complete a short survey that we'll drop in the chat so we know how it went and if you found it informative. All right, Scott, I'll hand it over to you.
All right, thank you. And thank you all for coming on tonight. I know there's probably lots of people who want to watch the debate tonight and weren't sure if you kind of wanted a double dose of politics and economics, but I appreciate you tuning in. So what I'm going to do tonight is I'm going to talk about income inequality, and I'm going to do it maybe a little bit different than I initially thought, maybe a little bit different than you thought was going to be done, but I think it'll be informative, and it'll be in a way that I think you will find instructive to talk to your students. I'm gonna take again, as I typically do, as I think all economists try to do, at least to some extent, be agnostic about the different views. I just want to explain, I think, what I see is going on in the debate, and allow you and kind of help you and help the students understand what's going on, again, especially for those who are teaching economics at the high school level. One of the things I wanted to do, is to go back and I'll hopefully only spend a short amount of time talking about how I typically introduce income, the distribution of income to my class in a very simple way. And I'll take about 10 or 15 minutes of doing that, and then I'll dive into kind of the current debate. But I think it's good for students to understand why you'll naturally see a distribution of income, and the distribution could be quite large, and there's not necessarily anything wrong with that. So I go back to a book written in 1987, and I found this. I was preparing this, or I reflected back on it, and George Stigler wrote, almost 40 years, more than 40 years ago, or about 40 years ago, talking about the size distribution of income, and by that he means the distribution of households by size of income has been a most important question of public policy over periods in many countries, an intensive economic study of the distribution of various societies. But until recently, they've emphasized the moral and ethical factors. There's been tons and tons of these studies done. Again, these factors are important, but also what's important are the structural and economic aspects of the problem. And that's going to be what we really focus on here. So again, I'm going to start in a very simple way of thinking about how we would naturally see some distribution of income across individuals and over time. And then I'll jump into the current debate and try to help us understand what's going on with these different measures. So first of all, it's important to talk about why we care. So that's going to be the first thing we introduce. Second thing is going to be like the basic review of income inequality, overviewing some of the challenges. And then, like I said, understanding these recent measures of income inequality. So why do we care? Of course, there's the moral and ethical reasons. I think any person kind of looking at what some of the richest people in the US or across the world make relative to some of the people who are less fortunate would think that there are some moral reasons why that there is something wrong with that income distribution or ethical reasons. So I have, as an economist, I have very little to say on kind of that moral side. That's a stand, that we'll all take. But focusing on the economic side, one of the things that we worry about with this greater concentration of income is that those individuals will wield potentially more economic power, and that can manifest itself in many ways in terms of monopoly power or ability to influence markets. So that's one of the concerns we have. A second concern of why we care is these more affluent people will also can lead to a greater concentration of political power. Right? They can lobby politicians or become politicians and move laws and regulations in their favor for them to gain more power, to gain more wealth, gain more money, potentially at the expense of other people. Also, if we think that this is a large problem, and they're using this concentration of economic or political power, it can reduce economic efficiency and slow down growth in the economy. It can decrease institutional accountability. Again, people could be potentially bought off or persuaded to look the other way. And then kind of lastly, it can lead to a stagnating middle class. And that's, a real concern. I think that people have seen over the last 30 years is concern about what is happening with the middle class and people who are less fortunate. So those are the reasons that I think most people care about the income distribution. It's always important to put things like that up front. Again, the basics of income distribution. I always start with my class in thinking about a world in which everybody within an occupation are identical. So again, suppose we had a world in which all individuals were identical. They had the same abilities, the same training, same experience, equal wage, and worked equally long and equally hard. We would still see inequality exist at any point in time. We would see inequality exist because there are personal factors. Some people may have good health, bad health, accidents. Again, good luck or bad luck will lead to personal factors that will drive some inequality across individuals. There could be employer factors. There could be physical things that accidents happen at the plant or with the firm, or economic hardships that come across. All those things will influence output, productivity, and worker pay. And then there could be market luck, just simple market factors. Some individuals may have luck finding a job, finding new work, and they could just stumble across that. So one of the basic things that we would see, even in a world where everyone's the same within an occupation, same abilities and everything else, luck plays a large role both in terms of personal, employer, and market factors. Now, suppose we go back and think about what would happen if we started everybody at the age of 17 or 18 and trace out their earnings over time. Over time, workers become more productive. I think I've become more effective as a teacher, as a lecturer, as a researcher over time as I gain more experience. And this increase in productivity, it comes with a higher pay. Economists are pretty good at measuring kind of this return to experience. And the typical income path of someone who started working, say, at the age of 17 would look something like this. As they gain more experience, their income would rise over time. Eventually, it kind of slows down, and then you retire here and kind of live out the rest of your life. If you look even at this case, you would expect to see fairly large differences in income over time. If you looked at someone at the age of 57, they would have an income of about 62,000, where someone who's about 18, 19, 20 years old would have an income roughly of 28,000. So again, if everyone had the same ability and followed the same income path over time, you would expect to see a fairly large range or difference in income over time. And then if you add those luck factors on top of it, that could even make those income differences even larger. Now let's think of another way to think about it. Suppose we keep most of the above factors constant, and we take people back to the age of 17 or 18 and trace out their earnings. But now we allow that for some people, they have the opportunity to go to college. Now, everybody has the same ability. So if we have completely competitive markets, we would expect some workers to sort into this occupation without going to college, and some workers would go to college and sort into that occupation. Since markets are perfectly competitive, what we would expect to happen over the lifetime is the present discounted value of their lifetime earnings would be the same. After all, their ability is the same, and their ability is the same. One group just chose to go to college and the other didn't. In equilibrium, on the margin, we would expect those lifetime earnings to be the same. So what would something like that look like? Well, the income for the person who started the occupation right out of high school will look exactly like before, but the person that goes to college will now have to pay for college, borrow for a few years. And then because of that, they're going to have to earn that money over their life cycle to pay back for the money they borrowed. So what you would see something like this, and then I worked this out this weekend, that these individuals have exactly the same present discounted value income over time, but you could imagine what happened. The blue line here is that group that went to college. They paid for college, out of their own pocket or somehow. And then they have this earning stream over the rest of their life, whereas someone who took the job, worked in this occupation straight out of high school would have that earning stream. And something like that, if we don't control for age and if we don't control attending college, even if they have the same ability, same lifestyle, at some point in time, you can get fairly large differences in income, even though the individuals have the same ability and they're working in the same occupation. But of course, we know all people don't work in the same occupation. So if we allow for different occupations and maintain the assumption of equal ability, we can again introduce more inequality. Some jobs may require even additional education. So think of two people with the same ability. One teaches at a college and has a PhD, and one teaches high school. Both teach economics. Well, what we would have to expect is the person who has the PhD, even though they have the same ability, would likely have a higher wage, largely because they spend additional years in college, just like that high school example. But other factors come into play as well. Some occupations have lower employment risks. You're less likely to lose your job, less likely to get laid off. If some workers, even though they have the same ability, they may have different preferences about risk. Those individuals will be willing to, some of those who want to avoid risk will be willing to accept the lower pay for more job security. So that idea of avoiding risk, avoiding employment disconnects will also introduce wage inequality. And then some occupations have higher health risks. Think of coal miners. Workers in this case need to be compensated for the positions they get in higher pay, and that'll also introduce some wage inequality, and we refer to those things as compensating differentials. So all of those things will lead to differences in pay while we're talking about workers with the same ability. Now, some occupations may require more ability, and it's really hard to define or quantify exactly what we mean by ability. Ability is really difficult to measure. It goes beyond IQ tests. Ability maybe for some people, college was easier for them or high school was easy for them, even though when they go out in the workplace, they're not more productive, but they were able to get more schooling because it was easier for them. We all had people that we knew that went through college without hardly opening a book, and some that gives them some advantage. Sometimes being ability just makes them more productive in certain professions. Also, it's very difficult to distinguish ability from luck, especially in the short one when you're looking over 5, 10, or 15 years. Somebody may be very lucky, and that may be perceived as they are have tremendous ability in that area. So again, identifying ability can be very difficult. But when we look across occupations, you could see pretty wide range of average differences in income. Surgeons are top coded at roughly 250,000. They make more than that. You could see chief executives on average make $160,000 a year compared to the lower end of, say, a bartender or word processor or a typer that make below 40,000. So again, lots of these factors that we talked about come into play here, and you can see across occupations, you're going to get a pretty wide range of differences in income. And of course, I more or less randomly chose these occupations the other night when I was working through this. I did have to throw in economists, and economists do pretty well on this schedule. So when we think about accounting for income differences, trying to explain is kind of taking a stock of what we said. Age is an important factor. We need to control for age. Work experience matters for productivity and wages. Education is important. We believe education makes workers more productive. If not, I don't know what what all of us are doing in the occupation that we're in. And that there are different things that go along with occupation, risk characteristics or differences in ability may be acquired. And then, as I mentioned, worker preferences in terms of how they want to take on risk. All of those things matter for income differences. I think where people really worry about income inequality is when we depart from competitive markets and perfectly working markets, and we think that the inequality is driven by either market power, where we have some firms that are underpaying their workers because they have market power in the labor market, or workers, on the other hand, may have some power through unions. There could be imperfections in the capital market that introduce more inequality than we would see otherwise. What I mean by that is a lot of people borrow to go to school. It's hard to borrow, without the government coming in and helping out in many instances. Borrow to get an education because you have no collateral to back that up. So that could lead to imperfections in the capital market, imperfect foresight of how an education will pay off. If it will pay off years down the road. And of course, we have many different types of discrimination that can lead to a difference in pay. That could be race, gender, religion, and all of those things. I think the things that people care about. But again, when economists think about thinking about differences in income, we think there are lots of natural ways in which income discrepancy will arise. And again, the main things that we always try to control for are age, education, types of occupation, worker preferences, and then we try to assess how much market power matters, imperfections in the capital market, again, lack of perfect foresight, and then we also try to measure typically discrimination in relatively crude ways. So again, that's just kind of a quick introduction that I went on a little bit longer than I would have liked. But more recently, I think in the last 10, 15 years, really 20 years from the economic side, there's been a series of papers really led by Thomas Piketty and co-authors looking at income inequality, mostly in the US, but they've done it now more so over time and across countries. The three notable papers and books is first is Thomas Piketty's Capital in the 21st Century, a widely popular book that probably some of you have looked at and read. Piketty and Saez was a very influential paper in 2003, Income Inequality in the United States from 1913 to 1998. And then Piketty and Saez more recently in 2018 wrote a paper on the distribution of national accounts, methods, and estimates for the US. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to kind of focus on that, on the Piketty and Saez and Piketty, Saez, and Zuckman. I'm sorry, the last citation also includes Gabriel Zuckman. And look at their numbers and then go back and talk about how other people have re-examined the numbers and give you some insights into the debate, why some people are saying, in particular Piketty, Saez, and Zuckman, why income inequality has increased dramatically, and why others have said, well, it may not have increased much at all. So let's start into that. If you look at the Piketty, Saez, and Zuckman income shares, if you go back to 1960, we're using their data, they found that in 1960, the top 10% of US workers basically made 31% of US income. By 2019, that grew to almost half of US income by just the top 10%. If you look at the top 1%, and that's the group we're going to focus on mostly here tonight, they started in 1960 earning about 8.3% of US income. And then by the end of the period, it was almost 18.5, 19%. So again, over the course of time, roughly 60 years, income for the top 10% has grown dramatically, of course, according to Piketty, Saez, and Zuckman. And I should state here too, my numbers will change a little bit given the sources that I'm using, but after like 2 or 3 slides, they'll pretty stay constant. In addition to the top 1%, if you look at the top 1% of the 1%, they argue that there's been even more kind of concentration of income, and it went from 2% roughly in 1960 to about 8% in 2019. So again, and one of their arguments is you go up the income chain, you're going to find even more and more concentration of income. More recently, papers by Otten and Splinter, and this is the one I'll refer to mostly, there have been others, have kind of challenged that view of Piketty, Saez, and Zuckman. So when they look at their data, if they look at pre-tax income pre-taxes and after transfer, the blue line here represents Otten and Splinter's measurements, and the red line compares looks at Gabriel Zuckman, Piketty, Zuckman, and Saez's numbers. That you do see some increase in inequality over time, but it's not nearly as great. If you look at the top 1% of 1%, again, seems to be, according to Otten and Splinter, you see roughly a doubling of that top 1% of 1%, but it's not nearly as dramatic, going from 1.3 to 2.6, as opposed to Piketty, Saez, and Zuckman that went from 2.1 to 7.9%. And then finally, you can kind of look at, I'll show the screen on the right here is kind of the punchline of Otten and Splinter, that if using their numbers and their calculations, income inequality went from 8.1%, that is where the top 1% in 1960 made roughly 8% of income. And then by 2019, it grew to 8.8%. Again, much different than the numbers presented in Piketty, Saez, and Zuckman, going from 9.1 to 15.1%. So what accounts for this difference? Here's the trick, and here's where I hope I can give you some insights in. Both papers use the same data. They're using tax records. Before this, I should say, before Piketty's influential important work, most of the work on income inequality was done by survey data. Going to tax data, actual tax filings, is going to provide more precise estimates. So again, both sets of authors use tax records to determine income shares. But here's the key: reported taxes are not equal to national income. So again, remember, these are workers reporting their taxes, and labor income is roughly 60 to 70% of national income. So what both sets of authors try to do is to make the numbers that they're reporting consistent with US's national income. So that means somehow they have to account for that other 30% of income, any year. How does that divide it up, and who does that go to? Another key thing that is different, that sets the original Piketty and Saez work different than the Otten and Splinter work, and corrected also in Piketty, Saez, and Zuckman, is that tax units are not individuals, nor are they households. And so that creates quite a bit of difference when you have different tax units are filing. Where also this comes into play is in terms of, as you look at these data over time, marriages haven't been as stable over time in the US, right? We've seen more divorce over time, but divorce rates are higher for the incomes below that top 1%. And that will introduce some biases in the data. So both the CBO and then Otten and Splinter wanted to adjust for these changes in marriage outcomes and try to make it closer to individuals and household measures rather than tax unit measures. So that's another important thing. And as I mentioned, what both sets of authors try to do is make their measures of people's income consistent with national income. Remember, think of national income as being GMP, the total value of goods and services produced by domestic residents. So again, you have to take that household income, roughly 60, 70% of total income in the US, and then you have to take the rest of that and apportion it off to individuals. So what distributional national accounting does, it combines that market income, that tax income, with missing market income and transfers. And I'll explain what missing market income as we go along. But this is what it looks like in terms of a graph. Market income is roughly 60% of total income. That's what people file on their taxes. That's the easy part of addressing this income inequality. The harder part is there's this what's called missing income. How do we apportion that between the top 1%, the top 10%, and everybody else? And then how do we allocate transfer payments? So when we look at the income inequality debate, it depends on how these things are distributed across individuals, right? So again, I'm going to take a nonpartisan, agnostic view and just kind of discuss the adjustments we're making. And I would hope that those of you who want to talk about this in your classes also talk about these in an even-handed way. So let's start first with kind of the Piketty-Saez number, where you have income in 1960 at the top 1% being about 8.3% of total income, and that rises to almost 20% by 2019. So what is the first adjustment made by Splinter and Otten? Is they make adjustments from tax units to individuals and households. So they realize there's the changing family structure. They also have to remove non-resident filers, right? So there's people not in the US who file taxes. They're not US workers. You got to take those people out. And then you have to consolidate dependents that are not at home. So I have some kids that some of my children are not living at home, but they're still classified as dependents who also file taxes. They have to deal with that as well. Then there's also pre-tax income that doesn't show up on tax returns. And these don't include transfer payments for the government. So these are income payments that people earn that have to now be allocated across individuals. So one of them is tax exempt interest. Think state bonds, local bonds, where you don't have to pay taxes on them. Those have to be distributed. That total amount has to be redistributed back to the population. And what they do is they kind of look at tax records and other audits and then redistribute that income according to what they've seen in the past. Corporate earnings, right? And corporate retained earnings and taxes, those things are have to also be allocated back to households because again, we're trying to get back to national income. And so who owns the corporate income, who owns those retained earnings and the taxes paid in, all have to be redistributed back. They make an adjustment for inflation correction. Those who borrow are more benefited by inflation than not, so they make that correction. And here's where one of the big aspects come in on this adjustment is there's a large amount of underreported or misreported income. And again, to explain where the difference comes in is this unreported or misreported income. You can think of it as stating it kind of crudely. Piketty, Saez, and Zuckman redistribute that misreported or underreported income. They view that as being tax evasion that's not reported because I'm evading taxes. So then how they distributed that income back up, it's proportionate to the size of your income. So that means those in the higher income category are going to get more of that unreported distributed income back to them. Whereas Otten and Splinter, and to a certain extent the CBO, in order for them to look how they decide to reallocate that underreported or misreported income, they went back to actual tax audits and looked at the incomes there, whether people were underreporting or misreporting their income. And they typically found that the lower income households were making mistakes underreporting or misreporting their income. So in their calculation, more of the unreported or misreported income went back to people below that top 1%. So that was a big adjustment that shifts the income distribution away from the 1% back to the rest of the population. Also, what has to be included back into income as we move to national accounts is that the income that individuals receive implicitly, the imputed rental income from living in their own house, gets redistributed back to the household. And then you include employer payroll taxes because in some sense, again, those are payroll taxes, Social Security, Medicare, paid by the employer. Again, it impacts people's wages and taking into account how that impacts wages on and above what the taxes were. So what this does, making these adjustments, goes from what Piketty and Saez call fiscal income to pre-tax national income. So once you've made all of these adjustments and you've added up the income of all the population, I now have total U.S. income. So again, these adjustments make it so that when I add up everybody's income, they equal GNP. When Piketty and Saez initial, calculation, what they did in 2003, again, very innovative at the time, right at the time, it added up to what they referred to fiscal income, which was not necessarily GNP. Almost everybody since then have tried to make the mapping of taxes and income received back into what income is. So kind of that's where we stand. Oh, and then you have to add back in indirect taxes that everyone pays. So you have to take account of how much, say you or I have paid in sales tax, and that gets added back onto our income, at least initially. So once you make that adjustment, what that does in the Otten and Splinter world is it increases the income of individuals in 1960 back, increases the income, excuse me, of the 1% in 1960 up to 10%, but decreases their ending income share to 13.8%. So that adjustment from looking at fiscal income to reapportioning all the income measures that Piketty income measures, so it maps into GMP, kind of flattens out the income distribution. I should also point out, and you could see it here in the graph, is this big jump here. And this is kind of important too. And one of the complications about doing stuff like this is that this movement here was nothing other than the Tax Reform Act of 1986, where that Tax Reform Act broadened the base, right, and lowered the rates. And so what that did is it incentivized people to report their income differently. And so a large part of this movement was really no change in the upper income of the households or of these individuals, but there was a change in the tax law that incentivized them to report their income differently. Now you go back and you want to add back in transfers. So what are transfers? They're those things that the government pays in some sense back to the household. So those are going to include kind of standard things that we think about. Include Social Security benefits, unemployment insurance, other cash transfers. Think of this as stimulus checks in 2008, tax credits, Medicare, and so I should say all of those are relatively easy to calculate and fairly straightforward. And then you have other non-cash transfers. You have things like Medicare, SNAP, so then you can think of food stamps, school lunches, housing assistance, and other in-kind transfers. So again, what gets tricky here and what's up for debate is how you count these non-cash transfers. We know that if I was going to give you a choice of would you rather have $5 or a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, most people would take the $5, so they prefer the cash rather than the in-kind gift. So again, you'll see some differences in the data from how you value the in-kind transfers from giving cash back. So a little bit of the difference comes in there. But most of these are pretty easy to measure and fairly straightforward. So once you add those in, again, that lowers because the 1% individuals aren't getting as much of those. It kind of lowers their share to 9.8%. So this is the blue line that calculates that includes income plus transfers, and also then lowers the share at the end to 12%. So all of the transfers ends up kind of pushing down what the top 1% makes. The final adjustment that's made, and again, this is not without a fair amount of scrutiny, is then you have to then take in after-tax income and other things. So income with transfers, what you're going to subtract off is federal income and estate taxes, subtract off state and local income taxes, subtract off corporate property, payroll taxes, sales taxes, and other things. Some of those things that we took off before, now we end up adding back in because we wanted to keep a specific tax category in here. What becomes more controversial about this aspect of it is also then you have to then appropriate some aspects of the government. So government deficits. What Otten and Splinter assume, and it's not what what Piketty, Saez, and Zuckman assume, is the government deficits imply higher taxes. The Otten and Splinter assumption assumes that this future tax burden is going to fall more on higher incomes because we have a progressive tax system. So then they face a higher tax rate because they're going to have to pay for the higher incomes are going to have to pay for the higher government deficits. Also, what's included in this category, it's kind of not labeled here quite correctly, is the government provides services. So who should get credit in some sense is that's part of the, again, in-kind gift the government to people. So one of them things that we could all think of here is education. So how do you value education and who should get more of it? Well, again, Otten and Splinter take a little bit different assumption than Piketty, Zayas, and Zuckman, and they say that education primarily will go to individuals with lower incomes, so they give more of the spending on education to lower income households. That may sound good for education, but it becomes a little bit more difficult when you say, what is the value of the national park? How do I distribute that income? How do I distribute police and fire protection? And how do I distribute the value of the services and to who gets the services from things like national defense? So all of those things are a little bit more tricky, more difficult to add in. But once they add in that final aspect, you can again imagine that in the Otten and Splinter world, that's going to pull down the income distribution in the following sense, that we think that the tax system is more progressive, so the higher income are going to face a higher tax. In addition, we have more services and more government services that are going to be paid to lower income households. And so again, that's going to pull down the share of that 1%. So in the end, once you go from the Piketty, Zayas, Zuckman world of just looking at fiscal income, where the inequality almost doubles, more than doubles from 8.3 to 18%, you get into the Otten Splinter world, where it barely goes up at all, 8.1 to 8.8%. But it is noteworthy to say, if you go back to 1979 and the year in which kind of Reagan came into office, the growth in income inequality, even using the Otten Splinter numbers, go up from about 7.2, 7.4 to 8.8%. So again, it's not to say that Otten and Splinter don't have any growth in inequality. It's just much more muted. So again, if you kind of put these together and you kind of look at the adjustments and think about here's the initial Zayas and Piketty work, excuse me, you could see the difference in shares from 1960 to 2019. The top 1% had 8.3, and now they had 18%. So that's a growth of 9.7 percentage points. Then you start making the adjustments. So they make adjustment to the income groups. Again, that's adjusting for the size of the population, household units, the changing marital status. That reduces their estimate by 2.4 percentage points. If you come up with a better measure of fiscal income that maps more directly into how we measure national income, and you believe the assumptions of Otten and Splinter, it reduces that percentage point by another 3.8 percentage points. If you look at pre-tax income, it has a modest effect, and after-tax income, they believe that the federal income taxes are much more progressive than what's argued in Piketty, Zayas, and Zuckman, and that reduces it to another 2.5%. Again, getting us to that total difference. So again, those are the assumptions and quick discussions of why, using the same data, people come up with different numbers. If you look at what happens to the say the bottom 50% of the income distribution as a share, again, doing the same type of exercise, Piketty and Zayas says that the bottom 50% in 1960, they roughly had 17% of income, and by the end, they had 10%. So again, a fairly dramatic decline in income shares by the bottom 50%. But if you start making those adjustments made by Otten and Splinter, again, thinking that a majority of the transfer payments go back to lower income households, and a lot of the misreporting on taxes are from lower income housing, lower income families. You see almost no change in the income share of the bottom 50%. It was 27.2 and ended up at 26 percentage points. So a little bit of a decline, but not nearly as drastic as an almost halving that Piketty and Saez found. If you look at levels, again, what you see is a fairly rapid growth rate. And a lot of the change here, and you'll see it in the next couple slides, a lot of the change here comes from as you add in that national income, and then you add in the transfer. So those are the big differences in their view, is getting those national incomes right, making sure that that misreported income or that non-market income, missing income gets reapportioned to individuals, how they do it. And then once you add in transfers that typically go back to lower income households, again, you see that raises their income quite a bit, and that the taxes have a modest effect. And I'll skip that. So kind of looking at things, and I think these are a series of interesting slides, and I've almost run out of time, but allow me about 5 more minutes to talk about this. So if you look at the bottom quintile, the average income earned by the bottom quintile is roughly $5,000. Once you add in transfers and taxes, their income, again, these include in-kind transfers, their income rises to roughly $49,000. So initially, the Saez-Zuckman didn't include transfer payments, and it's really hard to measure income inequality without seriously taking into consider transfer payments. If you look at taxes, the percentage of income plus transfers, the bottom quintile has basically a 7.5% average tax rate. Their share of income, the bottom quintile, is 10%. The second quintile is they average 30,000 income with taxes and transfers. Again, they get more in transfers than they pay in taxes. They have a higher average tax rate, and their share of GDP is 11%. If you look at the middle quintile, average about 66,000. Almost net nothing in terms of transfers and taxes. And if you look at the fourth income category, you see they make on average 112,000, pay about 30,000 in taxes. And the top income category, on average, they make 295,000 and they pay about 30% in taxes. Now, what's also then interesting, at least from my perspective, and I hope that you see it as well, you see that share of income of that top 20% is 43.4%. Well, we can cut that up a little bit more into different aspects. So if we look at that top quintile and we look at the 81, the 90th percentile of income earners, they're making 179,000. They have after-tax income of 131,000, and they have a tax rate of about 30%. If you look at that group 91 to 95, their average income is about 243,000. So even that's a big number, and I realize that. But if you would ask, I think, the person on the street how much someone in the top 5% or of income would make, they would probably say millions of dollars. And if you lived in New York, you might not even live comfortably in New York as a tax unit making that type of money. Taxes on income and transfers is roughly 38%. If you look at the 96 to 99%, that is all the way up to the 1%, they make on average 354,000. So we're not even talking many famous actors or athletes yet at this point. Their income, their taxes, a share of income is 38%. And now I'll point this category out, that most of these people, even in the top income, aren't making a lot of their money from savings. I think a lot of people often think when they think of the top income earners, they're thinking of the Warren Buffett types who are making all of their money from investments and they're not working at all. You can see, even as you go up to the 99th percentile, not much of their income is coming from interest earned. But once you go beyond that, now you start seeing a change. If you looked at the 99.1, the 99%, their average income is just under $1 million. They pay a tax of about 40.9%, and about a third of their income comes from investment. And then if you look at the top 1% of the 1%, no, not quite the top 1%, the top 0.1%, what you see is now their incomes kind of shoot up. They make on average 8 million, take home of 4.5 million, and almost half of their income comes from investments. And then you go up from there, and you can see that a majority of the income is made from earnings. So again, this kind of gives you a snapshot of a picture, and I think a more realistic. I'm not sure that people see that how much like the 95th percentile makes. It's not as much as you would think, and it's really not until you get up into these last 1% as to when incomes really take off. And so what I want to close with here is looking at income sort of over time. We did a couple snapshots and showed mostly the top 1%, but what's happening with everybody else. So if you look at the bottom quintile, that is the bottom 20%, what's happened to their income over time? Well, it's this light shaded area. Their income really hasn't gone up much over time. But once you add in, which are these vertical bars, the transfer payments, you see that their income basically has tripled over time, or gone from up 300%. If you look at these other categories, you get a similar flavor. If you look at that second income quantile, here you can see the gray area. Actually, you can see it, that this is their earned income. You add in transfer payments, and you could see basically their income is roughly doubled if you go back. And of course, this is all adjusting for inflation. If you look at that middle income group, middle quintile, as almost like we had before, their income earned is almost exactly equal to their income after taxes, after transfers. And you could see a more modest rise of about 100% over time. Again, so if you want to look at this as the middle class, it hasn't risen as fast as these two quintiles, but it has gone up. It hasn't risen as fast as the fourth quintile. Now notice what happens here once you get to the fourth quintile. Their income is up here, and then this hashed mark area is what happens, is the taxes that get taken away. So their net income is actually below their total income. So this is income after taxes and transfer. And then once you get to the top quintile, again, you see much more of the income lost through the taxes, not much in the way of transfers. And so that pulls, again, their income down. So I guess I'll leave it at this slide. I should open it up to other questions, but I think this was a good slide to move things away from that top 1%, but to also look at what's happening with income with individuals in different income categories, not only looking at the income that they make from work, the income they make from assets, but also adding back in taxes and transfers, because that's an important aspect. So again, what I didn't do here, and maybe that's a different lecture, or as I add things on, I haven't tried to explain what are the factors that have led to a widening of the income inequality. I just wanted to talk about, and it could be boring, and I'm sorry if I bored you, but I wanted to go through kind of the accounting mechanisms and the assumptions that how two different researchers looking at basically the same data can arrive at results that are a little bit different. And again, it's how you believe or how you value those assumptions. And I think in some aspects, Piketty, Saez, and Zuckman make more sense. In other aspects, Otten and Splinters make more sense. And the CBO has also produced results, and as you could probably guess, the Congressional Budget Office numbers fall right in between those two. So I hope you found this informative. Again, it was a little bit drier. It was more of an accounting exercise trying to explain the differences in the techniques and why one group finds less widening of income inequality and another group found growing income inequality. So I'll open it up to any questions now if you have them. And again, thank you for attending tonight.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Baier. And just a reminder, I'm just going to put the survey in the chat and I'll put it in again, but right before we go. And it was a great visual to end on. Okay, so we had one question from the beginning about the difference between your slide mentioned, Raymond says, your
Yeah.
slide defined GNP as the total value of goods and services produced by domestic residents. Did you mean GDP? As isn't this the definition of GDP rather than GNP? Could you
No, so it's a very good question. There's a subtle difference. Luckily, in some ways in the US, it doesn't make a big difference when we look at the numbers, but in terms of making the accounting. So remember, GDP is the gross domestic product. So th that is the amount of production that takes place, income produced by factors that are on US soil. GNP is income earned by US residents. So if I am in another country or I'm a US firm operating in another country, that counts as part of GNP or national income. If I am a non-US citizen making money in the US, that counts as part of GDP and it's not counted as part of GNP because I'm not a domestic resident. So again, that's what they're trying to get at. And maybe I wasn't clear enough and maybe I didn't misstate it on the slide, but GNP or national income it's now called, refers to the income produced or income made by US residents or US firms, no matter where they live. GDP is income produced or made by workers on US soil, no matter where they come from.
Awesome. Thank you. Great explanation. A lot of people are interested in which textbook your department uses for intro level economics courses, if you want to change topics for a second and talk about that.
Yeah, so thanks. So I think there are a couple good books. You know, micro in many ways you can't go wrong. I think they're in most books are look pretty much the same. So Cowan and Tabarrok, I think, is a book that has been used around here quite a bit because they give examples that I think are striking, that the students will find those examples is interesting. They're not mundane widget examples, kind of real world examples. And I think another more lively book recently by the same uh, publisher is by Justin Wolfers and Betsy Stevenson. So those are two really good micro books. Macro books, those, of course, and Mankiw is always a good book. Macro, I think, is much more to the individual's taste. I know how Cowan and Tabarrok do their macro side of principles is much different than how Wolfers and Stevenson or Mankiw do it. So that ends up being more by taste. If you have any questions about a macro split or anything I kind of talked about or books, you go ahead. I don't mind responding to emails, and I could put my email in the chat if I know how to do that.
I can add it in there.
Okay, thank you.
We have another question from Mark. What impact does the impact of savings as a percentage of income really play on equality? What role can economic education play on the health of a nation's economy?
Yeah. Well, as I saw, I think I showed in that kind of last slide is that interest income doesn't really impact inequality or income up until you get to that really top 0.1% of the income distribution. That leads to a little bit of a different question. There's other ways of looking at inequality, of course, other than income. Income can vary a lot from year to year. If you look at wealth inequality, what we see when we look at the data, there's much greater differences in wealth inequality across the US and across countries. And part of that is driven by that interest income. So that's where it really becomes important, I think, when you're looking at wealth. Another way people look at inequality, and this may sound odd, but I think it is important in certain ways, is consumption inequality. That when you look at consumption inequality, that ends up you see much less inequality when it comes to consumption because most people need kind of the standard housing, standard food, and so there's not going to be as much difference there. So when you look at consumption equality, it's much less. But but in general, I don't think that asset return matters as much till you get to the top when you're thinking of income inequality. And the second part of the question was, what can we do from a
What role can education play on the health of a nation's economy?
well, I just think it makes a more informed voter, and I think it helps also individuals make wiser choices. I think that the economic way of thinking about things provides insights into basic decision making, but I also think it provides insights into understanding why other people made decisions as well. And I think it opens up your world beyond kind of the, hey, why did they do that? That had a negative impact on me. And then when you think of why that person may have made a decision, it it uh, it matters. In terms of the inequality, one of the parts I didn't go into in this discussion, I think it is open and we should do another webinar or another series on this, is it is when we think about inequality and we think about the moral and ethical aspects, I think oftentimes we envision in our mind some fat cat, excuse the term, Wall Street person who's doing nothing more than living off the interest income of these assets that they have. When you look at the richest people or the wealthiest people in the US, most of those individuals are first generation, moved into that as first generations. You do have the Waltons, they still show up there, but you have people like Bezos or Gates or other people, and at the time Steve Jobs, who came from more modest backgrounds, or the people from Google, and they created products that we really value, and we have to think about how much, what is the value society puts on those. And I think going back again, back to the pandemic, is I know the government did a lot and kind of helped out everybody in terms of transfer payments and stimulus check. But I often ask my students the question, where would we have been if it wasn't for Amazon? If Amazon didn't perfect or try to perfect or work on home delivery 10, 15 years ago, and we didn't have that so prevalent from Amazon, Walmart, Target, and pick your favorite store, where would we have been in the pandemic? And it would have been a much different world. How much would we be willing to give, say, Jeff Bezos for bringing that? And again, so I think when we think about the inequality, we have to think about the goods and services and the value we receive from the products those people delivered. Again, I'm not trying to be an apologist, but it is an important thing of these people are providing goods and services that we value.
Good, thank you. And I know we're over time. You're willing to take maybe one more question?
As long as people are willing to sit on here for.
Okay. Do we see movements? This is from Austin. Do we see movements of individuals from one quintile group to another?
Yeah, well, again, the data, especially with this, it lags quite a bit, right? It's hard to track this over time. So the most recent data, going back to say 2012, 2013, that time, we saw income mobility in two different ways that I think is the type that we would see. It was typically the case that the children of parents more likely than not did better than their parents in terms of income. So over time, people were moving up an income ladder. And also what we would see over time is that people would move up and down income quintiles. So if I would look at the same age group of people, it was possible for me to start low and end up higher. I think there are some legitimate concerns now about both types of those, about both types of that mobility. I think it is still there. It's still possible, but I look at what's happening now and I wonder, I'm not as confident that my children will make more income than I'm not as confident it'll be as easy to move up and down. So historically, we've been pretty good at what is often referred to as the American dream, about the ability to move up based on off our own hard work, and some of it's going to be luck and ability. But again, I think there are some warning signs out there that it may be more difficult for this upcoming generation. And I think we hear that in when you talk with people from the age of 25 to 35, they're more worried and more concerned about that. Good question.
Thank you. Okay, so unfortunately, that's all the time we have today. And please, again, I'm going to drop the link in the chat. If you could take a moment to fill out the survey so we can find out how it went for you and what we should do more in the future. So thank you so much, Dr. Scott Baier. And everyone,
Yeah.
enjoy, or I don't know if I should say, for the debate tonight.
Yeah. Again, I thank you all. I know you guys all have busy schedules, so logging in at this time of the evening or this time of the day, I appreciate that. And again, I think I don't know what you thought of this, but again, in general, I think FTE does a really good job at presenting timely topics and having people with some knowledge of these. So I hope you tune in for more of these type of talks. Again, thank you, everybody.
Good night.